Timelines in History presents Colonial America. Today in the Daily Dose, the Iroquois Confederacy. Centuries before the formation of the United States and its foundational constitution, the first known democracy in North America formed among a group of Native American tribes in northeastern North America, creating a unified League of Nations following a multi-generational pattern of wars between the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations. Known collectively as the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a sixth nation, the Tuscarora, would join the Confederacy in the 1700s, and while most historians cite the formation of the Iroquois Confederacy to some 500 years ago, the Iroquois date its creation back to 1142, when tribal leaders first believed that a total solar eclipse that year was a sign of future peace amongst the northeastern tribes. Guided by the Great Law of Peace, which was created by two visionary Native American heroes named Hiawatha and Digonawida the Peacemaker, passed down over the centuries in the oral tradition, the mythical duo helped the six nations of the northeastern tribes form their own constitution, establishing a federalist governance model replete with separation of powers and a participatory democracy. Designed to build a framework for the six Iroquois nations to come together on issues relating to trade, diplomacy, and defense, the Confederacy provided a system of equal representation among the nation's elected representatives, ensuring that all six nations had to agree on any decision before it could be implemented into Iroquois law, which eventually made the Iroquois Confederacy the most powerful political and military force in the region. When the Founding Fathers met at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 to debate the future of American governance, they had no contemporary European democracies to model themselves after, other than the ideologies and writings by the likes of John Locke and Montesquieu. They did, however, take note of the Iroquois Confederacy and its Federalist framework and constitution, as referenced in a letter by Ben Franklin in 1751, describing the need for the 13 colonies to form a voluntary union, similar to that of the Iroquois Confederacy, while John Adams' three-volume handbook, written for the constitutional framers as a survey of different types of governments, included references to the same body of Native American tribes, making the Iroquois Confederacy both a groundbreaking milestone in Native American intertribal relations, as well as a foundational primer for the U.S. Constitution. Today in the Daily Dose, the first slave revolt in the New World. While most historians have pinned the first slave revolt in North America on Toussaint Louverture's successful leadership of the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, recent scholarship by Robert Schwaller of the University of Kansas has uncovered a slave revolt in Panama that supersedes the Haitian revolt by some 200 years. Unearthing letters, royal edicts, and court documents discovered in the General Archive of the Indies in Seville, Spain, an archive devoted to the Spanish Empire in the Americas and Asia, Schwaller discovered a long history of slave revolts in Panama, beginning less than a decade after Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa first brought enslaved Africans to Panama in 1513. Those participating in the self-emancipation movement in Panama and elsewhere became known by the English term as Maroons, which in the case of the Colón province of Panama, tied up Spanish forces in a decades-long and quite costly guerrilla-style war that ultimately resulted in a negotiated peace in 1579, when Panama's High Court granted permanent freedom to resistance leader Mackenbick and his Maroon followers throughout Spanish territories in the New World. which in turn led to other successful freedom revolts in Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico, and Jamaica. After their freedom was affirmed by the Spanish court, Maroons formed their own self-governing communities around the Spanish fort of Portobello. Today, the Maroon communities in and around Portobello continue to thrive some 400 years after their formal emancipation, leading Schwaller to write that the amazing thing about Portobello is that the people who live there today have a direct connection to the people who came from Congo and Angola, many of whom were Maroons. They know their history, even though few outsiders do, leading other scholars like Ben Vincent III of Case Western University to laud Schwaller's work as a milestone pathway for teaching about rebellion and peace brokering among formerly enslaved people, making the Maroons of Panama the first successful slave freedom movement in North American history. Today in the Daily Dose, Squanto and the Pilgrims. Between 1492 and 1880, some 2 to 5 million Native Americans found themselves enslaved by European traders, including Tisquantum, or Squanto as he became known by early English settlers at Plymouth Colony. A member of the Patuxet tribe of the Wampanoag people, Squanto escaped his enslavement in Spain with the help of a Catholic priest, making his way to London, where he learned the ways and language of the English under the employment of John Slaney, treasurer of the Newfoundland Company responsible for colonizing Cupper's Cove in 1610. Finding passage home aboard 2 separate ships, Squanto returned to Patuxet, one of 2 Native Americans ever to do so, discovering the bleached bones of nearly 2/3 of his people, who would perish during the Great Dying, as the Wampanoags called it, caused by an outbreak of foreign diseases borne by European explorers. He also found a ragged group of English settlers aboard the Mayflower, who had lost nearly half their original number due to disease and hypothermia after living aboard their crowded vessel during the winter of 1620 and 1621. Uniquely poised to help the Puritans survive their harsh New England environment, Squanto helped the Pilgrims form an alliance with Wampanoag leader Osamoquin, birthing an agreement that helped the Wampanoag gain a powerful ally against their sworn enemy, the Narragansett. He also taught the Pilgrims how to hunt and fish for local indigenous food sources, while teaching them to grow corn and other sustainable crops in New England's fertile soils. Memorialized, if not mythologized, in the now popular American holiday of Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims most likely failed to invite the Wampanoag to their first harvest celebration, but rather attracted a tense gathering of some 90 Wampanoag warriors who had responded to a volley of celebratory gunfire unleashed by the Pilgrims at Plymouth. Once the warriors determined that the gunfire lacked any hostile intent, they contributed 5 deer to the feast before helping the Pilgrims celebrate their survival in November of 1621. Relations between Native Americans and European settlers soon deteriorated, however, after subsequent treaties led to the subjugation of Native Americans and the usurpation of Native American lands, leading some historians to speculate that Squanto may have been poisoned to death by his own people late in 1622, making the unique skills and diplomacies of Squanto an important lifeboat of sorts for early English settlers in the New World. Today in the Daily Dose, the lost colony of Roanoke. In August of 1587, 2 years after a failed English settlement attempt along present-day coastal North Carolina, 115 English settlers dropped anchor at Roanoke Island, determined to form England's first permanent community in the New World. Later that same year, as supplies ran short in the fledgling colony, Governor John White left his wife, daughter, and infant granddaughter behind when he sailed back to England for fresh supplies. only to find his ship conscripted into service during the Anglo-Spanish War of 1585 to 1604, when Queen Elizabeth I called on every available British ship to repel the powerful Spanish Armada. When he returned to Roanoke in August of 1590, he found little trace of the colony or its inhabitants, save for scattered clues about what happened to them, including the word Croatoan carved into a tree. The disappearance of the lost colony of Roanoke has stoked centuries of academic debate regarding what happened to the settlers, with precious little agreement regarding their fate, other than the fact that Croatoan was the name of an island south of Roanoke, now known as Hatteras, that was also home to a Native American tribe of the same name, leading some to propose that the settlers may have been killed or abducted by the Croatoans. Others believe that the settlers may have built a boat and sailed for England, only to shipwreck and perish at sea, while still others have proposed that the Spanish marched or sailed up from Santa Elena, the Spanish capital of Florida, wiping out the English settlement in the name of hegemony or solitary dominance in the New World. In more recent years, some scholars have proposed that the settlers may have moved further inland and were simply absorbed into a friendly Native American tribe, leading to a 2007 campaign to collect and analyze DNA samples from local families, both indigenous and otherwise, looking for matches in DNA connected from human remains left behind at the settlement site, making the lost colony of Roanoke an enduring mystery in the early days of North American colonial history. And there you have it, the lost colony of Roanoke, today on the Daily Dose. If you enjoyed this short educational video, consider giving the filmmakers a YouTube super thanks from as little as $1, so that you too can feed the filmmakers who feed your brain. Today on the Daily Dose, the early years at Jamestown Colony. During the Age of Exploration, superpower nations like Portugal, Spain, and England scrambled to establish colonies in the Americas, including Great Britain's failed lost colony of Roanoke, prompting English King James I to grant a charter for yet another attempt at colonizing North America. In response, the Virginia Company of London set sail in 3 ships from Blackwall Point on December 20th, 1606, the Susan Constant, the Discovery, and Godspeed, with 105 all-male settlers and 39 crew members, reaching the Chesapeake Bay in late April, before settling on a narrow peninsula of land along Virginia's James River on May 13, 1607. Known variously as James Fort, Jamestown, or James City, the settlers at first built a triangular wooden fortification around an armory, a church, and living quarters. And after 2 ships and all the crew members returned to England for supplies in the summer of 1609, the colonists were slowly felled by hunger, attacks by local Algonquian tribes unified under Chief Powhatan, and an array of illnesses such as typhoid and dysentery, most likely caused by contaminated drinking water from a nearby swamp. Known as the Starving Time of 1609, as winter set in, first-hand accounts tell of desperate people eating pets and shoe leather, eventually leading to the winnowing deaths of 100 settlers amidst horrid reports of starvation and acts of cannibalism. Come the spring of 1610, 2 ships returned bearing 150 new settlers and a cache of supplies, just as the original survivors were about to abandon Jamestown. Following the marriage of John Rolfe and Algonquian Princess Pocahontas in April of 1614, peace and trade between the settlers and native tribes ushered in a period known as the Peace of Pocahontas. And after Rolfe's introduction of a new type of tobacco grown from West Indian seed stock, the Jamestown economy began to flourish after its near extinction 4 years earlier. As improving conditions boosted confidence, the English began building other settlements up and down the James River, making the early years at Jamestown Colony a shaky start for white settlers in the New World. Today in the Daily Dose, the Great Dying. Decades before the Pilgrims made their landfall at Plymouth Rock, Europeans engaged in frequent contact with Native Americans from present-day Maine to Massachusetts, as English, Dutch, and Portuguese fishermen, Basque whalers, and French fur traders partook in the bounties of the region. By the time French explorer Samuel de Champlain explored Plymouth Harbor on a 1605 mapping expedition, he encountered native settlements of 67 Wampanoag villages, known collectively as Patuxet, scattered throughout Massachusetts and eastern Rhode Island, where, according to oral tradition and archaeological evidence, some 40,000 people flourished for more than 10,000 years, alongside other tribes of Massachusetts, Pennacook, Nauset, Permaquid, and Abenaki people. Embedded in the early lore of English settlers of Plymouth, the Great Dying began in 1616, when local Nauset warriors captured a shipwrecked crew of Frenchmen along the coast of Cape Cod, exposing Native Americans to a host of foreign diseases, which soon felled entire villages from Maine to Massachusetts, as a plague-like illness took the lives of an estimated 90% of the indigenous populations, prompting French Jesuit Pierre Bayard to write that the Abenaki are astonished and often complain that since the French mingle and carry on trade with them, they are dying fast and the population is thinning out, while English explorer Richard Vines noted that local natives were sore afflicted with the plague, for that the country was in a manner left void of inhabitants. After the Mayflower Pilgrims began to establish their colony at Plymouth, instead of a desperate struggle to survive New England's challenging landscape, they found entire deserted villages at their disposal, replete with untended crops, tools, and other supplies hastily left behind by a now deceased indigenous population. The Puritans soon embraced the notion that God's divine providence had cleared their new home by a miraculous pestilence, so that a new Christian society could take root in their chosen land, prompting early colonial merchant Thomas Morton to note that the recent depopulation of natives left the land much the more fit for the English nation to inhabit in, and erect in it temples to the glory of God, making the Great Dying a time of tragic loss for once thriving indigenous societies. Today in the Daily Dose, everyday life in colonial America. While life in colonial America was harsh compared to modern living standards, colonial Americans employed commonly used tools in their homes and village lives that helped them survive and even thrive, despite their exposure to frigid winters, increasingly hostile Native Americans, and the constant struggle for sufficient food stocks. Common tools employed in most colonial households included bayberry, whale oil, or tallow candles, which gave colonials their only source of light besides the family hearth fire, while children as young as 6 were frequently employed in carding, which removed tangles from freshly sheared wool, making it easier to straighten before spinning it into thread. While a formal education was considered unnecessary for young girls, most colonial children learned reading, writing, and mathematics from their parents or local ministers, using hornbooks as they were known, which was a sheet of paper attached to a tablet of wood, leather, or bone, all covered by a thin, transparent strip of horn, while well-heeled young girls refined and practiced their needlework skills on ever-present samplers. In an age before video games and mass-produced toys, colonial children made whirligigs out of bone, clay, and the occasional spare button, making for hours of simple amusement as they warmed themselves beside the family hearth fire. Other common household items included the fire bucket, which was employed in early bucket brigade firefighting, while time was told almost exclusively with the use of sundials. Although on overcast days, sundials became useless ornaments in colonial villages. Other basic conveniences within the colonial home included such medieval carryovers as pomanders, which usually included an orange studded with cloves and covered in oils and spices to give colonial homes a pleasant smell, while warming pans filled with hot ashes from the hearth fire were passed between bed sheets on frigid New England nights, warming straw-stuffed mattresses before colonials tucked in until dawn. Colonials ate off of wooden plates known as trenchers, generally with their hands, employing sugar nippers for much coveted sugar cones to add sweetness to foods and beverages. Salt cellars were another carryover from medieval Europe, defining the status of diners above the salt for guests of honor who sat at either end of the family table, while children and less important guests sat below the salt on either side of a table, making everyday life in colonial America a civilized stronghold against the daily challenges of a harsh new world. Today in the Daily Dose, Plymouth Colony. After landing at Plymouth Rock on December 18, 1620, so named by explorer John Smith after leaving Jamestown Colony, and chosen by the Pilgrims because Plymouth, England, was their port of embarkation over their first frigid winter in New England, the settlers lived aboard the Mayflower, while ferrying ashore during daylight hours to build their new settlement. Over the course of the winter months, more than half their numbers perished due to a myriad of infectious diseases, including leptospirosis caused by exposure to rat urine. Despite their dwindling numbers, a stroke of good fortune awaited the settlers when they moved ashore in the form of Squanto, a Native American of the Patuxet tribe who had been enslaved in Spain by John Smith's crew, where he learned the ways of Europeans before escaping home to his native land. Besides teaching the settlers how to fish, hunt, and grow native food stocks, Squanto acted as an interpreter and peace broker between Plymouth Governor William Bradford and Chief Massasoit of the local Pokanoket tribe. Early peace with Native Americans led to the first Thanksgiving in the fall of 1621, which comprised a good number of Pokanoket members, and 50 mostly male colonists, since 78% of the women who had arrived aboard the Mayflower had perished during the winter of 1620. Although Plymouth Colony would fail to develop the robust economies of later settlements like John Winthrop's Massachusetts Bay Colony, agriculture, fishing, and a modicum of trade made Plymouth self-sufficient within 5 years of its founding. As more Europeans poured into North America, including the arrival of the Fortune in 1621 and the Anne and the Little James in 1623, as a growing number of settlers spread out across New England, relations deteriorated with Native American tribes, leading to sporadic yet escalating violence that would culminate during King Philip's War of 1675, which took the lives of some 2,500 colonists. Plymouth Colony, however, made for an ideal blueprint for later European settlements in the form of the Mayflower Compact, which established rules of democratic governance over self-contained communities. Plymouth's influence in New England slowly declined over the coming years until its absorption by Massachusetts in 1691, making Plymouth Colony the first lasting foothold for European settlers in North America. The New England colonies and Native Americans. During the Age of Exploration, early contact between European explorers and Native Americans led to the deaths of 90% of North America's indigenous people, not through war or conflict, but through the introduction of foreign diseases such as smallpox, tuberculosis, measles, cholera, and bubonic plague. Unintentional disease transmission continued into the 1600s, when English colonists populated the New England colonies of Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, New Hampshire, Connecticut, New Haven, and Rhode Island. And while some colonial leaders such as Puritan minister Increase Mather believed that the decimation of native populations was proof that God blessed colonial expansion, other leaders used the devastation as a way to convert Native Americans to Christianity, creating praying towns, which were the first examples of reservations for Native Americans. At first, an uneasy peace existed between the colonists and the nearly 60,000 Native Americans living near English settlements, where Native Americans traded hides, food, and local knowledge in exchange for beads and other forms of currency known as wampum. For the colonists, early trade exchanges proved vital to their survival, while Native Americans sought to build alliances in order to strengthen their fight against indigenous enemies, a critical disconnect that would hinder their ability to unify forces against foreign encroachment onto their lands. For the colonists' part, a mere 5 years after their arrival, the Plymouth colony became so self-sufficient due to their relationship with Native Americans that they no longer required financial support from Great Britain. Relations between Native Americans and New England colonists slowly eroded over the course of the 17th century, coming to a head in 1675, when local authorities at Plymouth executed 3 members of the Wampanoag people for the murder of Christian Indian John Sassamon, who had previously warned the colonists about a planned attack by local Native Americans. Known as the First Indian War, or King Philip's War, the struggle would see 14 months of bloody conflicts between colonists and Native Americans, leading to thousands of deaths, casualties, and displacements, a preamble of sorts for the next 2.5 centuries of sporadic fighting between Native Americans and westward moving settlers. Today on the Daily Dose, life aboard the Mayflower. In a sea voyage originally planned for 2 ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, after a month and a half of fixing leaks aboard the Speedwell, the Pilgrims at last combined their numbers onto the Mayflower for a sail across the North Atlantic from England to northern Virginia. Originally built to haul cargoes of lumber, fish, and wine on short coast-hugging trips between port cities in Europe, 37 crew members and 102 passengers, including 41 pilgrims and 61 strangers, as the non-believers were known, set sail on September 6, 1620, spending the next 2 months crossing 3,000 miles of open ocean. Measuring 100 feet in length with a 24-foot beam, the crew of sailors, carpenters, cooks, surgeons, and officers were housed in small cabins above the main deck, while the Pilgrims were consigned to a suffocating, windowless space between the main deck and the cargo hold. Sharing their space with a 30-foot sailboat known as a shallop, the Pilgrims jammed into a space measuring 58 by 24 feet, with a headroom just shy of 5 feet tall, where they erected small wooden dividers or hanging curtains to provide a modicum of privacy. Surviving on meager rations of hardtack, dried meats, and beer, the constantly pitching hold left most of them seasick, adding the acrid smell of vomit to the misery of their space. After a month of calm seas and smooth sailing, the Mayflower encountered an unrelenting series of North Atlantic squalls, forcing the crew to repeatedly refin sails, which left the small ship bobbing helplessly in towering seas. Blown badly off their original course, on November 9, 1620, after a 66-day ordeal that witnessed the birth of a baby boy, the Pilgrims made landfall at present-day Plymouth, Massachusetts, prompting Pilgrim leader William Bradford to write, "Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof." Miraculously, the Mayflower suffered only 1 fatality under sail, a young indentured servant named William Budden. The Pilgrims' fate, however, deteriorated badly when they remained aboard the Mayflower through a bitterly cold New England winter, emerging in the spring of 1621, with more than half their original number lost to disease and hypothermia. And there you have it, life aboard the Mayflower, today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube, or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today in the Daily Dose, the Mayflower Compact. Of the 102 passengers aboard the Mayflower, just 41 were true pilgrims seeking religious freedom from the Church of England, while the rest were made up of merchants, craftsmen, and indentured servants, who the Pilgrims called strangers. For their part, the Pilgrims had signed a contract with the Virginia Company to occupy land near the Hudson River, which was then part of northern Virginia. But after treacherous shoals and worsening storms drove the Mayflower badly off course, they landed near present-day Cape Cod, Massachusetts, which was well outside the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company. Discord immediately ruled the day when the strangers proclaimed that they were no longer bound by the Virginia Company's charter or contract, nor did they feel the need to recognize any rules, since there was no formal government presiding over their lives. Pilgrim leader William Bradford would later write about the situation, that several strangers made discontented and mutinous speeches. Knowing that the Pilgrims needed every productive hand to make their colony a success, they created a provisional set of laws to rule the colonists by majority consent. Now considered a relatively short document in today's wordy jurisprudence, the Mayflower Compact established that the colonists would remain loyal subjects to King James, despite their need for self-government. They also agreed to create and enact laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices for the good of the colony, and to abide by those laws, while creating a singular society where all men and women would work together to further its success, all the while living in accordance with the Christian faith. As a result, on November 11, 1620, the day the Mayflower made landfall, 41 adult male colonists signed the Mayflower Compact, and while it remains unclear who actually penned the document in question, many historians give credit to Pastor William Brewster. One key signer was Miles Standish, an English military officer hired by the Pilgrims to accompany them to the New World for the purpose of military leadership, who in turn played a key role in enforcing the new laws, as disputes and conflicts inevitably arose over time between the fledgling colonists. Today on the Daily Dose, the first Thanksgiving. Autumnal celebrations of Thanksgiving harken back to early man, when human survival depended largely on animal and agricultural husbandry, which made the coming of winter the scariest time of their collective lives. Once their winter food stocks were harvested and stored, there was a communal sense that this was all they had to carry them through the barren days of winter, giving early man a commonly felt swallow of trepidation. Instead of worrying over their future survival, early man flipped their fears into a celebration of abundance and thanksgiving, which continues to resonate to this day. When the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, England, in September of 1620, 102 passengers made a treacherous 66-day passage to Cape Cod after being blown badly off course from their intended destination at the mouth of the Hudson River. 1 month later, the Mayflower sailed across Massachusetts Bay, where the Pilgrims established the village of Plymouth. Spending their first winter aboard the Mayflower, half of the Pilgrims would perish from exposure, scurvy, and the outbreak of infectious disease. Once the surviving Pilgrims moved ashore the following spring, an English-speaking Native American named Squanto, who had learned English while enslaved by an English sea captain, taught the Pilgrims how to cultivate corn, extract sap from maple trees, as well as hunting and fishing techniques that vastly improved their food stocks. After the Pilgrims' first corn harvest proved successful by November of 1621, Governor William Bradford called for a feast with the Native Americans who had helped them survive their first months ashore. Considered America's first Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims' feast with the Wampanoag Indians lasted 3 days, consisting of dishes likely prepared using traditional Native American spices and cooking techniques. The meals most assuredly lacked cakes and pies, due to the Pilgrims' dwindling supply of sugar by the fall of 1621. But surviving Pilgrim diaries attest to a variety of dishes, including lobster, seal, wild turkeys, waterfowl, and deer, making the first Thanksgiving one of the first and last times that white European colonists and Native Americans would break bread under a common banner of peace. New Amsterdam. After the Dutch West India Company established its North American foothold in 1624, the region around present-day New York City grew outwards from the southern tip of Manhattan Island to include parts of Long Island, Connecticut, and New Jersey. Known collectively as New Netherland, the Dutch settlement's seat of colonial power soon formed around the initial fur trading factory next to South Manhattan's Fort Amsterdam, which soon took on the name New Amsterdam. In an attempt to shore up Dutch claims to the region, acting Governor Peter Minuit arranged for the purchase of New Amsterdam from the Manhattans, an indigenous tribe of Native Americans who in 1626 swapped South Manhattan Island for $24 worth of Western European trinkets. Like nearly all groups of white settlers to North America, land agreements with Native Americans quickly went off track as land-hungry settlers expanded outward from their initial claims and agreements, leading to a protracted war between colonists and the Manhattans beginning in 1641, eventually leading to more than 1,000 combined fatalities on both sides of the conflict. By 1655, however, New Netherland had grown to 2,000 people, with 3/4 of the population living in New Amsterdam, while 9 years later, the population of New Netherland had grown to 9,000 souls, with some 2,500 living in Lower Manhattan. In an ongoing challenge over sea and trade routes, particularly to the Spice Islands and the sugar plantations along the coast of Suriname, on August 27, 1664, 4 British frigates sailed into New Amsterdam's harbor, demanding the immediate surrender of the entire Dutch colony. England's aggression led to a bloodless and rather gutless capitulation by the Dutch, resulting in a document known as the Articles of Surrender of New Netherland. New Amsterdam was quickly reincorporated under British law as New York City, named after the Duke of York and future King James II, making New Amsterdam an early ignition point for one of the greatest cities in the world. Today in the Daily Dose, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Chartered in 1629 by King Charles I, the Massachusetts Bay Colony settled in North America the following year by a group of some 1,000 Puritan refugees from England, led by Governor John Winthrop and Deputy Governor Thomas Dudley, empowering the company to trade and colonize between the Charles and Merrimack rivers of present-day Massachusetts. Instead of a structured business entity with shareholders and profit sharing, however, the Puritan patentees transferred its management and charter to Massachusetts itself under a shrewd and legally questionable move that paved the way for local governance and an assumed independence from the British Crown, establishing the communities of Boston, Charlestown, Dorchester, Medford, Watertown, Roxbury, and Lynn. Establishing a theocratic government from the onset, the Massachusetts Bay Colony limited its membership to Puritans only, who believed that God had chosen a minority of people, the elect as they called themselves, for salvation, while the rest of humanity was destined for eternal damnation in hell, which in turn set Puritans on a path of constant spiritual anxiety and an endless search for signs of God's favor or displeasure. Led by Winthrop Dudley and the Very Reverend John Cotton, along with other key leaders, the group sought to eliminate any variation of religious dogma, banishing the likes of Roger Williams of Salem and Anne Hutchinson of Boston, not to mention unrepentant deviates such as Quakers and Anabaptists. Fed up by the colony's increasing estrangement from British rule, the company's charter was revoked in 1684, before the royal government merged the colony with Plymouth and Maine in 1691. The colony's continued defiance and spirit of independence led to an increasing number of punitive acts by the British Crown, which collectively became known as the Intolerable Acts, such as the Stamp Act of 1765, the Tea Act of 1773, which led to the Boston Tea Party, and the Administration of Justice Act of 1774, commonly known as the Murder Act by colonials. With colonial unrest at a breaking point, British taxation without representation in Parliament led to the convening of the First Continental Congress in September of 1774, followed by the outbreak of the Revolutionary War on April 19, 1775, making the Massachusetts Bay Colony the founding crucible of American independence. And there you have it, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, today in the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today in the Daily Dose, the Mystic Massacre. After Puritan settlers from Massachusetts Bay Colony spread into present-day Connecticut, conflicts with the Pequot people of southeastern Connecticut set off the Pequot War of 1636 to 1638, which saw English settlers and their Native American allies, the Mohegans and the Narragansett, take up arms against the increasingly violent Pequot. After the English accused Pequot warriors of murdering 13 English settlers and traders in the summer of 1636, Henry Vane and John Winthrop accepted Pequot chief Sassacus's explanation for the murders, who in turn agreed to pay wampum to atone for the deaths. But when Vane sent Massachusetts Bay Colony Governor John Endicott to one of the Pequot's forts to demand additional wampum, at the same time demanding Pequot children be held as hostages to ensure the natives' good behavior, the Pequots refused. After Endicott attacked and burned several Niantic villages on Block Island, followed by a Pequot village along the Connecticut River, the Pequots retaliated with a string of raids on English settlements that persisted into the spring of 1637. With an eye on eliminating the Pequot threat once and for all, Endicott organized a large military force. But before they could march, 200 Pequot warriors responded to the buildup on April 23rd, attacking a Connecticut settlement that took the lives of 6 men and 3 women, while 2 young girls were taken hostage. In response, on May 26th of that same year, the Puritans and their native allies set fire to the Pequot's fort at Mystic before slaughtering upwards of 500 to 700 men, women, and children in less than an hour, although many scholars believe the death toll was far higher than that. Looking to annihilate the Pequot people, a second slaughter took place on June 5th near present-day Stonington, while a third slaughter took place on July 28th near present-day Fairfield, effectively ending the Pequot War, as well as the majority of Pequot people. Of the 3,000 Pequots living in Connecticut prior to the Mystic Massacre, at war's end, an estimated 200 Pequots remained alive. Of the survivors, most were sold into slavery, while a fortunate few were absorbed into other local tribes, making the Mystic Massacre one of the bloodiest events in early colonial history. Today on the Daily Dose, the Pequot War. After Dutch and English settlers encroached upon the approximate 250 square miles of Pequot territory in southeastern Connecticut, tensions simmered between the Native American tribe of some 4,000 men, women, and children who would survive the smallpox epidemics of 1633 and 1634, despite robust trade alliances in fur and wampum between the Pequots and their foreign invaders. Attempting to break the Dutch Pequot hold on the fur trade following England's late arrival into North America, after the July 1636 murder of English trader John Oldham by the Manassas people of Block Island, Massachusetts Bay Colony sent a force of 90 soldiers under the command of Colonel John Endicott to the site of Oldham's murder, with orders to kill all the men while capturing surrendering women and children. Establishing a base camp at present-day Crescent Beach, after the first amphibious landing in the New World, Endicott's forces were reduced to burning native villages after the Manassas fled into the swamps for safety. Moving on to the Thames River, the English burned Pequot villages in retaliation for the 1634 murders of English trader John Stone and his crew, which prompted Pequot warriors to lay siege to Fort Saybrook during the autumn and winter of 1636, before raiding towns in Connecticut that led to the deaths of some 30 English settlers. Raising a militia of colonists from the Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Saybrook colonies, along with some 270 Mohegan and Narragansett warriors, both avowed enemy of the Pequots. In the pre-dawn hours of May 26, colonial forces led by Captains John Mason and John Underhill slaughtered some 500 Pequots in what would become known as the Mystic Massacre. Fleeing their villages in desperation, the surviving Pequots were captured by Mason and 200 English and Mohegan fighters in mid-June, in an event memorialized by the English as the Fairfield Swamp Fight, while the Mohegans and the Narragansetts signed the Treaty of Hartford on September 21, 1638, which cemented the fate of the surviving Pequots. While some were absorbed by other area tribes, the majority were enslaved in Bermuda and the West Indies, while still others were enslaved to English households in Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay, making the Pequot War a green light turning point for English dominance in the region. Today on the Daily Dose, Bacon's Rebellion. Following a string of setbacks for the colonists at Jamestown, including falling tobacco prices, rising cost of English goods, and a string of hurricanes, floods, and dry spells, the colonists at Jamestown had good reasons to seek out a scapegoat for their problems. They found their whipping boys in two stubborn and hot-headed colonists, Virginia Governor Sir William Berkeley, a veteran of the English Civil Wars, a frontier Indian fighter, and a scholarly playwright, and Nathaniel Bacon Jr., whose father sent him to Virginia in hopes that his troublemaking son would mature under the more desolate and subsistent conditions on the American frontier. The colonists also found their scapegoat in the form of local Native Americans, who had begun a series of retaliatory raids on English settlements after colonists like planter Thomas Matthews failed to make payment for goods obtained from the Indians. Colonists soon rallied behind Bacon, who led a series of raids against Indian settlements, despite Berkeley's repeated reprimands and calls for restraint, in the hopes of preserving alliances and trade with local tribes. As Indian raids intensified, discontent accelerated as taxes were raised to pay for an army in defense against Native Americans, which in turn saw Bacon elected general of a self-appointed militia when he promised to bear all costs of planned campaigns intended to push Indians out of Virginia. Tensions reached a boiling point from July through September of 1676, which witnessed screaming face-offs between Berkeley and Bacon's supporters in front of the State House, leading to the kidnapping of the wives of several of Berkeley's leading supporters. With Bacon now in full control of Jamestown, Berkeley made several attempts at a siege until Bacon burned Jamestown to the ground on September 19, 1676, which led to an abrupt decline in his popular support. He died equally abruptly on October 26 of that same year from bloody flux dysentery caused by body lice, returning Berkeley to power before he was relieved of duty by King Charles. 23 people were hanged for their part in the rebellion and subsequent destruction of Jamestown Colony, making Bacon's rebellion an early foreshadow of Americans' growing thirst for independence. Today on the Daily Dose, Blackbeard. Born Edward Teach sometime around 1680, little is known about Blackbeard's early life or where he was born. Some claim Bristol in Western England, while other maritime historians point to Jamaica. Still others claim that his early sailing experience had been on privateer ships during Queen Anne's War, before settling for a time on the Bahamian island of New Providence, where privateer Captain Benjamin Hornigold gave Blackbeard command of a captured sloop. After Hornigold's retirement from piracy, Blackbeard captured a French slave ship known as La Concorde, renaming her the Queen Anne's Revenge, before equipping the ship with 40 guns and over 300 buccaneers. Soon earning a reputation as a shrewd and calculating leader, Blackbeard shunned the use of violence in lieu of his fearsome appearance, which struck instant terror into the hearts of his victims. Lighting cannon fuses draped from his thick black hair and beard, Blackbeard soon became the archetype for the sort of bloodthirsty rogues who once roamed Caribbean and Atlantic coastal waters. After forming an alliance of pirates off South Carolina's coast, Blackbeard blockaded the port of Charlestown, ransoming the city's wealthy merchants before accidentally grounding the Queen Anne's Revenge on a sandbar near Beaufort, North Carolina. Avowing his retirement from piracy from his new home at Bath, North Carolina, Blackbeard was given a royal pardon, only to relapse into piracy a short time later. In response, Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood mustered a joint force of soldiers and sailors in pursuit of the wayward outlaw, leading to Blackbeard's death in a ferocious battle on November 22, 1718. Blackbeard's head was driven onto a piling off Hampton, Virginia, a warning of sorts for other would-be buccaneers approaching the coastal waters of the British colonies. Hundreds of years after his death, Hollywood enshrined Blackbeard as the penultimate cinematic pirate, beginning with 1952's Blackbeard the Pirate, followed by a half-dozen more, including a TV miniseries and an encounter with Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides, making Blackbeard one of the most enduring bad boy legends of high seas piracy. And there you have it, Blackbeard the Pirate, today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. Today on the Daily Dose, the Salem witch trials of 1692. Epicentered in Colonial Salem Village, Massachusetts, in the spring of 1692, a group of young girls became afflicted by violent contortions and uncontrollable bouts of screaming. They soon accused several local women of witchcraft, which rapidly spread religious-inspired hysteria throughout the colony, pitting neighbor against neighbor as long-simmering jealousies and resentments were given a thinly veiled outlet for revenge. Rooted as far back as 14th century Europe, Colonial Puritans believed that the devil gave his disciples vast powers to harm others in exchange for continued loyalty, which in 1692 Massachusetts gained added traction after a recent British war with the French fought mainly on colonial soil, a recent smallpox epidemic, ongoing fears of attacks from increasingly hostile Indians, and a long-standing rivalry with the more affluent community of Salem Town. After a witch trial court was convened, a homeless beggar named Sarah Good and a Caribbean slave named Tituba were brought to trial, along with a poor elderly woman named Sarah Osborne. While the young accusers writhed and contorted and screamed in court, Good and Osborne denied their guilt while Tituba confessed, intimating that many others in the community practiced devil-worshipping witchcraft. The finger-pointing quickly snowballed into a maudlin display of false accusations and subjective hearsay, which saw more than 200 colonials accused of witchcraft. 19 of the accused would be hanged by the neck, while 5 others died in prison. After the mass hysteria had worked its way through, respected Minister Cotton Mather warned of the dubious value of spectral or circumstantial evidence, while his father, Increase Mather, president of Harvard College, later joined his son in urging that the standards of evidence for witchcraft must be equal to those of any other crime. In 1976, a study published in Science magazine cited the potentially hallucinogenic fungus ergot, sometimes found in rye, wheat, and other cereal grains, may have been the underlying cause of the young girls and their odd spasmodic behavior, making them the original turn-on, tune-in, and drop-out generation. And there you have it, the Salem witch trials, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Queen Anne's War. Nearing the end of the Age of Exploration, France, England, and Spain waged war against one another as they jockeyed for control of their North American colonies. Fought during the reign of Queen Anne of Great Britain, from 1702 to 1713, Queen Anne's War was the second of 4 great conflicts that made up the French and Indian Wars, each superpower backed by indigenous bands of Native Americans in 4 distinct theaters of conflict. The first was fought in the American South, involving Spanish Florida and England's province of Carolina, fought between French and English colonists at Fort St. Louis de Louisiane, near present-day Mobile, Alabama. And while little territory changed hands, the battle seriously decimated Native American populations in Florida and Georgia, and witnessed the destruction of a network of Spanish missions in Florida. A second front was New England, where repeated British expeditions pounded Quebec City and the Canadian border frontier of Acadia, including the 1710 capture of the Acadian capital at Port Royal, while French colonists executed repeated raids of their own on the English province of Massachusetts Bay, most famously the 1704 raid on Deerfield and the 1707 raid on Groton. A third theater was Newfoundland, where the English colonists at St. John's conducted economically destructive raids on French colonists at Plaisance. And while French colonists successfully captured St. John's in 1709, the British quickly reoccupied it after a French withdrawal. A fourth frontier comprised ongoing maritime battles from New England to Acadia, where privateers captured 102 English vessels, which led to a British victory, when English naval warships captured Acadia in present-day Nova Scotia. Following a preliminary peace in 1712, Queen Anne's War officially ended in 1713 with the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht, which saw France cede the territories of Hudson Bay, Acadia, and Newfoundland to Britain, while retaining Cape Breton Island and other small island possessions in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And while the treaty ended war between the superpowers of the day, its lack of redress to indigenous communities in North America set the stage for years of future conflicts between European American settlers and Native Americans, collectively known as the Indian Wars. Today on the Daily Dose, the Great Awakening. Following the Age of Enlightenment in Europe, which emphasized science and logic over religion, many colonists lost interest in Christian worship, preferring to focus on wealth building and rationalism. By the late 1720s, however, many colonists began to long for a return to religious sanctity. Nor were the colonies homogeneous in their Christian faith, finding most of New England adhering to congregational churches, while the middle and southern colonies were made up of a hodgepodge of Quakers, Anglicans, Lutherans, Baptists, Presbyterians, and the Dutch Reformed. Preachers who embraced the Great Awakening emphasized the notion that all people are born sinners bound for hell without salvation, which could only be achieved through confession and forgiveness through the grace of God. While Great Awakening leaders were in large abundance in the 13 colonies, Jonathan Edwards is considered by historians to be one of the movement's most influential stars, where he preached justification by faith alone. Known for his passion and energy, his 1741 high-water sermon entitled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God" was circulated widely throughout the colonies. Edwards was also credited with hundreds of conversions, which he chronicled in his book entitled Narratives of Surprising Conversions. George Whitefield was another preacher of high impact, who toured the colonies tirelessly up and down the Atlantic seaboard. Known to shout out the word of God as he trembled at podiums, in 1 year alone, Whitefield traveled over 5,000 miles, delivering more than 350 sermons. Known to be charismatic, theatrical, and overly expressive, even Ben Franklin, a professed religious skeptic, was so taken by Whitefield's talents that the two became friends. Known as New Lights by those that embraced the Great Awakening, many historians maintain that the movement directly influenced the Revolutionary War by amplifying the notions of nationalism and individual rights, while the movement also led to the founding of many renowned educational institutions, including Princeton, Rutgers, Brown, and Dartmouth universities, making the Great Awakening an uplifting experience for colonial Christians everywhere. Today on the Daily Dose, the 13 virtues of Ben Franklin. Through an extensive study of the world's major religions and various moral codes, founding father Ben Franklin came up with a list of 13 main virtues to which he felt that everyone should strive to live by. Once established, Franklin dedicated himself to building up these virtues in himself, developing self-editing charts to record his daily progress, ensuring that his results were always one of upward improvement. Once he had mastered a given virtue, he then moved on to focus on the next in line in his ongoing push for self-excellence. Franklin's first virtue was temperance, where he proclaimed, "Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation." Although in his later years, Franklin became quite a prodigious consumer of alcohol. His second virtue was silence, where he advised, "Speak not but what may benefit others or yourself, and avoid trifling conversations." Third was order, so that all a person's belongings had their rightful place, and each part of one's business had its time. Fourth was resolution, where he encouraged people to perform without fail whatever that person resolved to do. Fifth was frugality, which suggested that a person should make no expense but to do good to others, while sixth was industry, where people should lose no time and always be employed in something useful. 7 was sincerity without hurtful deceit. "Think innocently and justly," he wrote, "and if you speak, speak accordingly." 8 was justice, where he encouraged his colonial brethren to wrong no other man, while 9 was moderation in all things, and 10 was cleanliness, both in body, clothing, and home. Tranquility made up his number 11, where he encouraged readers to be not disturbed by trifles or by accidents common or unavoidable. Chastity made up his number 12, where he wrote to rarely use sex but for health or offspring, while Franklin's last virtue was humility, where he encouraged people to imitate Jesus and Socrates. And there you have it, The 13 Virtues of Ben Franklin, today on the Daily Dose. Today on the Daily Dose, Poor Richard's Almanac. Almanacs were wildly popular in colonial America, offering a mixture of seasonal weather forecasts, practical household hints, puzzles, and other amusements. At the age of 27, Franklin published his first Poor Richard's Almanac in 1732, growing his brand in popularity for the next 25 years, primarily because of its extensive use of wordplay, as well as some of the witty phrases coined in each year's edition, many of which have become a part of the American vernacular. Franklin adopted the pseudonym of Poor Richard for his fictional author Richard Saunders, and each of his yearly almanacs contained a calendar, weather forecasts, poems, sayings, as well as astronomical and astrological information, including the occasional mathematical exercise. Poor Richard's Almanac is chiefly remembered, however, for being a repository of Franklin's many aphorisms and proverbs, many of which live on in American English today. No Pain, No Gain is a spin-off of Franklin's There Are No Gains Without Pains. Diligence is the mother of good luck. Keep thy shop, and thy shop will keep thee. Fools make feasts, and wise men eat them. To be humble to pride dines on vanity and sups on contempt. It is ill manners to silence a fool and cruelty to let him go on. The wise man draws more advantage from his enemies than the fool from his friends. He that lives upon hope will die fasting. Hear no ill of a friend, nor speak any of an enemy. Necessity never made a good bargain. Published without interruption from 1732 to 1758, Franklin's Almanac sold exceptionally well during its long print run, reaching an annual printing of 10,000 copies a year, making Poor Richard's Almanac one of the first bestsellers in American history. Today on the Daily Dose, King George III. Born in 1738 England, the first of 5 Hanoverian British monarchs to be born on English soil, George III was crowned King of Great Britain in 1760 upon the death of his grandfather, King George II, ascending to the throne at just 22 years of age. A year later, he met for the first time and married on the same day Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, in a political yet loving union that bore the couple 15 children. After working tirelessly to bring an expedited end to the 7 Years' War, in 1764, in an effort to pay down war debts caused by Britain's latest conflict with the French, Prime Minister George Grenville introduced the Stamp Act upon Britain's colonial subjects in North America, igniting rising discontent in the 13 colonies over the issue of taxation without representation in Parliament. Nearly a decade later, Prime Minister Frederick North, with King George's firm backing, imposed the Tea Act on the colonies, which led to the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, followed by the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, which marked the opening hostilities of the American Revolutionary War. Perceived as an inflexible tyrant by American colonials, in truth, British Parliament, not the Crown, was ultimately responsible for colonial policies, although King George clearly had direct and indirect means of influence over Parliament's governance of its American subjects. Upon Britain's defeat at the Battle of Yorktown, a disbelieving King George went so far as to draft his abdication speech before deferring to Parliament's peace negotiations with its former colonies, resulting in the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which formally recognized the United States as a sovereign nation, at the same time ceding Florida to Spain. As war with the colonies raged on, in 1778, King George spiraled into a months-long bout of violent insanity, where doctors restrained him in a straitjacket and forced the king to undergo an assortment of treatments, until he recovered the following year as a renewed symbol of English stability during the Napoleonic Wars. He lapsed into a second round of insanity in 1804, recovering yet again until he slipped into his final and prolonged madness in 1810, passing away a decade later, both deaf, blind, and mad. While historians at first attributed his madness to an inherited metabolic disorder known as porphyria, a 2005 analysis of King George's surviving hair samples pointed to arsenic poisoning, which was commonly used in medicines and cosmetics of the day, making the life and madness of King George III a trying time for the British crown. Today in the Daily Dose, the French and Indian War. When the French built Fort Duquesne near present-day Pittsburgh, the incursion on British colonial soil sparked the 7 Years' War, known by American historians as the French and Indian War of 1754 to 1763. During the early years of the conflict, British war efforts were hampered by lack of interest back home and France's strong alliance with Native American tribes, which led to a succession of British defeats by colonial and British military leaders, including a young George Washington, General Edward Braddock, and Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts. The tide would turn in 1757 when newly minted British leader William Pitt borrowed heavily to hire Prussian mercenaries to fight the French in Europe, while reimbursing the colonies for their efforts to raise an army in North America. By July of 1758, British troop buildups in the colonies led to Britain's first significant victory at Louisbourg, near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, followed by a second British victory a month later when British troops stormed Fort Frontenac, near present-day Kingston, Ontario. After General John Forbes captured Fort Duquesne in November of 1758, later rebuilt and renamed Fort Pitt, British General James Wolfe overwhelmed the French at the Battle of Quebec in September of 1759, which would ultimately cost Wolfe his life, along with French commander the Marquis de Montcalm. When the British took Montreal in September of 1760, the French lost their last foothold in North America. After Spain joined France in fighting the British, for the remainder of the war, Britain's focus shifted from North America to French and Spanish territories elsewhere in the world. The French and Indian War in North America ended on February 1, 1763, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, obliging France to hand Canada over to Great Britain, while Spain ceded Florida to the British in order to regain control over Cuba, which in turn saw France cede Louisiana to Spain. While the removal of European colonial rivals from North America opened up the Mississippi Valley to westward expansion, the war doubled Britain's national debt, prompting King George II to reason that the 13 colonies should contribute to paying down Britain's war debt in return for its liberation from European colonial incursions into North America. The King's policies would lead to the wildly unpopular Townshend Tea and Stamp Acts, which further outraged colonists under the unifying banner of no taxation without representation, which ultimately led to the American Revolution. 15 years after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, French resentment over its losses in North America would lead them to side with the newly formed United States of America in the Revolutionary War. Today in the Daily Dose, the Great Acadian Expulsion. Migrating to Nova Scotia from the rural Vendée region of France in search of a better life, the Acadians began settling in Acadie along the Bay of Fundy, a region with the highest tidal fall in the world. But when the sovereignty of their land moved into British hands after the 1713 signing of the Treaty of Utrecht, by 1730, British authorities forced the Acadians to swear their neutrality in any further conflicts between the constantly warring British and the French. In the years that followed, the Acadians' fate became increasingly tenuous when Britain and France undertook a game of hegemony by building forts and naval bases a mere stone's throw away from each other. When Fort Beausejour fell to English forces in June of 1755, British Governor Charles Lawrence noted some 279 Acadian militia among the defeated, and when Acadians refused an oath of British allegiance the following month, Lawrence ordered their deportation from Nova Scotia, a move well received by recent immigrants from New England who coveted the Acadians' fertile lands. On September 5, 1755, Colonel John Winslow ordered all Acadian males 10 years or older to assemble at a church in Grand Pré, the heart of Acadian Nova Scotia, informing them of the confiscation of their lands, homes, and livestock, while New Englander Charles Morris devised a plan to surround the church with like-minded men before breaching dikes and burning Acadian homes and crops. By the fall of 1755, Acadians were forced aboard ships bound for Pennsylvania, Georgia, South Carolina, New France, Cape Breton, and the northwestern headwaters of the Petitcodiac River. Between 1755 and 1763, some 10,000 Acadians were forcibly removed from British-held Nova Scotia, many dying from disease, starvation, and squalid conditions aboard ships, forcing Acadians to wander North America in search of missing loved ones and peace-loving places to live. Although the Acadians were never shipped to Louisiana by their British oppressors, many were drawn to the French possession due to a commonality of language and culture, beginning the steady migration of Acadians into Acadia, as it is now known, well into the 1820s. Throughout their tragic ordeal, Acadians managed to hold on to their sense of heritage and identity, as reflected in the music, language, and food still prevalent in Cajun Louisiana to this day, displaying a remarkable resilience of human will in the face of abject inhumanity displayed by the British, making the Great Acadian Expulsion another low-water moment in human history. And there you have it, the Acadian Expulsion, today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com.